My wife, Carolyn, always teases me about the very first time that I met Emilie Griffin and her husband, Bill, because I was scared to death. The author of Turning, a book on conversion. Oh, why couldn't I think of a title like that? The author of Clinging, a book on prayer. Why didn't I think of a title like that? And then her husband, for years, senior editor of Macmillan Publishing. When I met him, religion writer for Publishers Weekly. For those of you who don't know, that's big stuff among writers. And then we met. Dallas, Texas it was, in the Adolphus Hotel. And it was like just this meeting. It was so wonderful. And since those days, Emilie and Bill are both part of a little group, a national group of writers that I'm part of, and it's just been a delight. Her thinking on prayer as a person who's an advertising executive, wrote a book called The Reflective Executive, who leads seminars on prayer, who does advertising campaigns for Alcoa Aluminum. That's an interesting combination, isn't it? And she's now with us and has been on our team some years. Emilie Griffin, it's a delight to have you. Would you welcome Emilie Griffin? Where'd she go? Oh, there she is. I didn't see her.
Thank you, Richard. You know, you're not the only one who can be intimidated by meeting another writer. I too was. Thank you so much for that. And I would like just to express my own joy and gratitude at being with you, being part of the Renovaré movement, but specifically this meeting in which there has been so much learning, so much enthusiasm, so much hunger, so much joy, so many questions, so much to enrich all of us, and so I'm feeling the lift of that, the enthusiasm. And I want to also express particular gratitude for the book, The Divine Conspiracy, and for Dallas Willard's courage in writing it and disclosing so much of himself in that book. Such a personal book flowing out of his own experience. And in his chapter 7 on the community of prayerful love, we see a lot of his own prayer life flowing there. And so that's a great resource for all of us, and so I want to express gratitude for that. About prayer, I have always found or felt that prayer is just built into the structure of ourselves. It is a hunger very, very deep in our natures, very deeply embedded in the human heart. And I think most of us begin to learn to pray out of need, or perhaps even out of emergency situations or times of sorrow or difficulty. When I was thinking about this, I remembered that when I was 20 or 21 years old, I was in an earthquake in Mexico City. It was a rather severe earthquake. It was 7 degrees on the Richter scale. And you know earthquakes, if anyone's ever been in one, they're measured in seconds, not in minutes. But they seem to go on for a very long time. And during that earthquake, I prayed from the beginning to the end, and no one had to instruct me, now it's time to pray. But there's another kind of prompting to prayer which comes out of the wonderfulness of things. And very often this experience comes to us so early that we don't know what to call it. We don't have any language to go with it. When the American writer and Cistercian monk, Thomas Merton, was about 5 years old, he was standing outside in New York City in the borough of Queens, in what was farmland then, on a Sunday morning, and he heard church bells, and he saw birds flying. And he said to his father, "Father, all the birds are in church. Can we go too?" C.S. Lewis describes a moment of great longing and beauty next to a currant bush on a summer's day. Only many years later was he able to connect this experience of sacredness with the existence of God. But it was an experience of longing and of yearning. For myself, I can remember being about 10 years old in a summer camp on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi. And on Sunday evenings, it was kind of a Renovaré experience. We'd all get together and we'd sing. Out on the pier over the Gulf of Mexico with the sun setting and the darkness coming and everyone singing together. And one hymn in particular I remember called Jubilate that we sang. And there's a sense of joy that comes in a flash at moments like this without warning. It is God calling us and speaking to us about his love. And gradually we begin to understand and to express our love in return. But as we get older and more serious about the disciplined life, we know we have to go beyond spontaneous moments like that and emergency alarm bells. Building a prayer life that has shape and structure, and one that can be maintained over time. I want, though, to remind you of something that Dallas Willard says in his chapter on prayer. He says, however far we go in learning about prayer, we are fundamentally building on request. The heart of prayer, he says, is request. And I think whether we go into contemplative life or whatever we do with our prayer, we are fundamentally building on that yearning, that need, that longing, that asking, which is what Jesus instructs us about. Now, we want to apprentice ourselves to Jesus in prayer as in every other thing, and take him as our model and our teacher, remembering to an extent or trying to reconstruct what his own prayer life was like, that he was brought up in a devout Jewish home in a society dedicated to a disciplined life of prayer. And he took part, no doubt, in formal worship or some kinds of spiritual exercises at least 3 times a day. But then in everyday life, there was always a blessing to be said or a prayer to be said over every single activity, whether it's the breaking of the bread or the healing of a person. Jesus would always pray as he did these things. But even at that, he couldn't get enough of prayer. He still had a greater hunger than the culture he lived in could satisfy. So he looked for times of quiet and solitude. And we find some of these mentioned in the New Testament. In Mark, in the morning, this would be very early before the day began, while it was still dark, Mark 1:35. He got up and went out to a deserted place. We see instances of this over and over again in Mark 6 after the feeding of the 5,000, in Matthew 14 after he dismissed the crowds and went up to a lonely place on the mountain to pray, and the disciples came after him. And then again in Luke, as the word spreads, Jesus has to withdraw in order to have times of prayer, that he can really communicate with his Father, and after the healings and so forth. So we understand that Jesus was always engaging himself with the life of prayer. And it wasn't a random activity with him. It was the way he lived, always in touch with his Heavenly Father. And you know that statement he makes, "For I know, Father, that you always hear me." So this was an ongoing exchange. It's what some of the great spiritual writers have called union, a kind of connectedness, being with God all the time. And Jesus wanted us to have this kind of life. That's what his teaching was all about, as Dallas tells us so nicely, that the reign of God is available right now. Now, when we look at prayer the way Jesus did, we see it's something very large and freeing. It's not a little thing, but it's a big thing that we can dwell inside of and enjoy and rest inside of. But nevertheless, one that requires our constant, ongoing cooperation and rededication and beginning, new beginnings in prayer over and over again. Let's look at some of the creative opportunities that we might engage in for entering into the life of prayer. Festooning, that's an expression that C.S. Lewis used. And I think he thought he had invented this, but I'm not sure he did at all. His idea was to take some familiar prayer that you already know, like the Lord's Prayer, and decorate it like a Christmas tree, festoon it, embroider it with extra requests and ideas and reflections of your own as you go along, so that the prayer becomes more elaborated than it was before. And one of the things that I noticed when I was looking over the chapter that Dallas Willard's book has on prayer is that there's a great deal of creative appropriation that we do to make prayer our own kind of prayer. And I think that's what C.S. Lewis was suggesting, to take a prayer which has belonged to the whole community of the faithful and make it your own, seize it, and involve yourself in it in a particular way. For example, in Dallas Willard's translation of the Lord's Prayer in the Divine Conspiracy, which is in fresh language, there he's making the prayer fresh again for himself. And slowed down prayer, he also tells us about having engaged in this use of the Lord's Prayer slowly, in which you might take a phrase or two and then reflect or live within that particular phrase for a time, and only slowly go on to the next part of the prayer and be led more and more deeply into the presence of God as you do this, breaking it down phrase by phrase. There are prayers of a single phrase, Abba or Yahweh, some like to use nowadays, although in ancient times that name of the Lord was rarely spoken. Or Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And there are some who say that this one kind of praying in which there is a repetition and a breathing, not a vain repetition, but a repetition that leads us more deeply into the presence of the Lord, that this is a very, very helpful way of prayer. Lectio Divina, I will join Richard Foster in the use of the occasional Latin phrase. Lectio Divina really means holy reading, but it's a particular style of prayer which has been used from ancient times and into our own, and we have many wonderful instructors on this. And you notice how all these ways of praying that I'm suggesting are attached to Scripture and the Word of God in some way. And Lectio Divina, we will take a text and we will allow ourselves to be led into the presence of God through the text in a very simple process of yielding to the presence of God in the text itself. Now, to actually practice Lectio Divina, you will need a little instruction, and you will find that there are many wonderful teachers of that. But it is a way of dwelling in the presence of the Lord through a closeness to His Word. Meditation, very often, there are so many different ways of meditation, but the one that I'm fondest of allows me to take a Bible story and identify with one of the people in the story. I've had a wonderful experience with Hannah and Samuel, entering into their lives briefly and acting out the story in my prayer so that I am called into the experience of God through them and through their life. And so this can be a very vivid style. The Psalms, of course, are one of our greatest schools of prayer, and this was the prayer book that Jesus himself used. So when we are using the Psalms as our school of prayer, it's our gymnasium, our climbing bars, our workout, because all of the emotions, the whole range of relationship to God is well represented in the Psalms, and they've been burnished by the experience of thousands and thousands of prayers through the centuries. And as we enter into the Psalms, we enter also into the experience of the whole communion of saints. All these styles have a lot of value, and they are styles. They do not have or bring any particular graces with them. It is the Lord who brings the change in us when we are willing to yield ourselves to prayer. So let us remember always that God is doing the leading and we are doing the responding in and through these particular methods or styles. But we always have the great teachers of prayer to caution us against becoming over-entranced with any method or giving too much credit to method. Meister Eckhart is only one of the many who says, do not restrict yourself to any one method, Those who receive God thus do him wrong. They receive the method and not God. It is God whom we are seeking, and we approach him in any of these many different ways and many more that I'm sure you already know about and are using. Environments and situations may also lead us closer to the Lord if we use them well. And for some of us, natural beauty may be a wonderful way. There are some who just love to sit in a garden or to bring flowers into the house and to find that beauty engages their attention and makes them praise the wonderfulness of God's work. I have had, if you're in a retreat setting or if you're in an outdoor setting and you're praying, you may find that the stones speak to you. I had a wonderful experience at a retreat house in Colorado where I was on a stony path, and then I heard in my heart and in my mind that the angels had charge over me lest I dash my foot against a stone. So the environment, the natural environment, may lead us back into Scripture, which is dwelling in our hearts already. Cityscapes, urban landscapes, not always so beautiful, may also become a tremendous source of prayer for us. And especially if our heart is with a city, this is often a very good place to pray. I made a day of retreat once on Wall Street in order to reflect specifically on economic power. But while I was there, I was also able to enter the church in which George Washington prayed, in that great environment in Lower Manhattan, and to see the place where Washington said farewell to his officers, and this wonderful place to be, which was so urban and so noisy, but so full of history and so full of meaning, was for me a wonderful place of prayer. Someone mentioned to me just moments ago Sister Helen Prejean and her work in the St. Thomas Housing Project in New Orleans. And I also had a prayerful experience of pilgrimage through the Desire Housing Project. Not nearly as much a place of power as Wall Street. Nevertheless, it is possible to give our heart to the cities that we love by praying in their most difficult places. This is also a call to prayer. Solitude and silence, I think, have been mentioned by many of our speakers as wonderful resources for us to use. And I loved the silence at this meeting. After the blowing of the shofar, the silence was so moving, so powerful, so palpable. So we see that silence can come to us in so many different contexts and lead us. But often going apart, as Jesus did, becomes a way of being more connected with the lives that we already have, not more separated. Anne Morrow Lindbergh wrote a wonderful book, Gift from the Sea, out of a month of solitude at the shore. But she spent the time reflecting on her marriage and what it meant to her, so that this apartness was really for the sake of others and not only for herself. God leads us into deeper understandings sometimes when we take time to be silent or to be apart. The poet Patricia Hampel speaks of going into the hush where the voice can be heard. And Henry Nouwen says that silence is a destination, a space where we can hear God speak to us. About praying with works of art, I noticed that some of you had copies of Henry Nouwen's wonderful book about the prodigal son. He enters into the story of the prodigal son through a great painting of the prodigal son. And for many of us, a great work of art can be a leading into prayer, if we use it that way. For me, at various times, one painting that has spoken to me very strongly is Stanley Spencer's painting about the general resurrection, the resurrection at Cookham. And I only recently saw it again in its full splendor, and it reminds me that I too am entering into the resurrected life. Friendship, I think we all know the tremendous power of spiritual friendship, and Renovaré groups, of course, honor that and seek to foster and facilitate that, seeing Christ in the other person. Also, our own transformation becomes clearer to us through the eyes of others. And this is the community of prayerful love that Dallas Willard is speaking of. Community in a larger sense is also a way to prayer. I mentioned the cities, also the fact that groups form. This is an expectation of the kingdom, that groups form and celebrate the life of the Lord in a special way. Community styles of prayer, like the Quaker style of praying, can become very intense styles of prayer in which the presence of God comes among us in ways that are very transforming to us. And there are some individuals who join their prayer to the life of the nation or to the life of the city. In Richmond, we heard people praying specifically for the needs of the city of Richmond and joining themselves to the life of the city in a special way. So, work also can be a wonderful ground of our praying. I love the story that is told of Simone Weil, who was a great writer on prayer, who died just at the beginning of the Second World War. Simone Weil prayed the Lord's Prayer in Greek. And I can't do that. I'd like to learn. And when she prayed the Lord's Prayer in Greek, she was on a grape farm in a vineyard picking grapes. And she felt very intensely the presence of Christ in the middle of the grape picking, in the middle of the Greek Lord's Prayer. And this is an example of work and prayer in unity. But there are many, many stories. Janice Brewy, who is a Roman Catholic sister and a consultant on midlife spirituality, tells a story of finding the Lord in the green beans. When she was picking the green beans, she suddenly had an intense experience of being loved in the middle of a very simple domestic activity of work. And so we always want to be aware that the Lord can speak to us literally where we are and not exclude our work from our life of prayer. Adventures. I like adventures. I like to plan them, but then I like to be surprised by things that I didn't plan. Retreats offer this. Sacred spaces, I'll come to in a moment. Pilgrimages can bring us into bounteous experiences that we didn't know would be totally ours until we got there. So we need to be open to spiritual adventures. And in sacred spaces, I think, we often think of chapels and places with wonderful stained glass. And we've made a sacred space here out of the George R. Brown Convention Center, wouldn't you agree? But also, there are other places where great events may have taken place. I'm thinking, for instance, of Gettysburg, or Waterloo, or perhaps the Normandy beaches, or maybe a visit to the Vietnam Memorial in Washington. I remember someone told me to take at least 4 handkerchiefs when I went there, and I did not think that 4 was enough. In these places, we may also be close to the sacrificial courage of others and be deeply inspired by that and hear the Lord speaking to us through the courage of others who have gone before us. So this is also an opportunity for prayer. The reign of God is available. It is here at hand. We experience this in so many different places, in so many different ways, but our willingness is what counts. The Lord is always wanting to speak to us. We are the ones that have to open up and allow that to happen. Our willingness is most important of all. And as part of that continuing surrender, I have tried to describe the experience of prayer with some of its doubts and difficulties along the way as an encouragement to others. I had so much joy and enthusiasm in making many of these life discoveries, and I thought, how can I share this with other people? And to do that, I would mention to you that when we are in this wonderful net of grace that we are speaking of, we may encounter at least 7, maybe there are more, but I took a biblical number, 7, and identified what I would call 7 different ways that we experience prayer, or moods, when we are living in the net of grace. And they can come in any order. They're not a sequence to be followed or any particular description exactly of how to proceed, but rather discoveries of places that we may find ourselves when we are in dialogue with God. There is beginning. John Henry Newman said, "The most perfect Christian is ever but beginning, and comes home again like the prodigal son to be forgiven again and again." So that is beginning, and it happens over and over in the Christian life and in the life of prayer, that we need to renew and renovare and dedicate ourselves again to this experience of prayer and overcome the sense that prayer might be a boring or a tiresome duty, but plunge in to the wonderful splash of the experience of God creatively. Yielding, a mood in which we are able to set aside and fully surrender ourselves and get rid of false expectations that we may have had from the past, or painful hurts or experiences, or false ideas of God, the hard taskmaster and so forth, the one who constantly wants us to measure up. Sweep those aside and enter into the loving presence of God, rediscovering the beauty of God's love in yielding. And this is a creative process when we appropriate prayer for ourselves and make it our own. There is darkness. I must tell you there is darkness. And some people describe it as dryness or times of trial. But sometimes darkness is just a long, boring patch when nothing much seems to be happening in our relationship to God. And we wonder whether it will ever end. It's an abyss of sorts, but it's not always romantic, and we can't always explain it to our friends and relatives. But to name this darkness is to put ourselves with Jesus in the school of prayer. He experienced darkness, little darkness when his disciples didn't listen, or when whole towns turned away from him, and big darkness in the garden or on the cross. By placing ourselves with Jesus, we gain the strength to persevere. And I was reminded in reading the Community of Prayerful Love chapter of that text, James 1:4, which Dallas renders as, "Patience in trials will make us fully functional." I like that. So for darkness, patience is the recommended practice, and perseverance to continue in prayer, even when it's not always full of bells and whistles and lightning flashes. To draw a box around darkness with the crayon of our prayer. What I call transparency is merely that kind of clarified vision that Jesus wanted his disciples to have. And he speaks of this, and this is, of course, part of the transformation that is described so well in the whole Sermon on the Mount. Friendship in the Spirit, I've already touched on. This is, of course, the binding power, the friendship of the saints, Paul and Timothy. And it's akin to the experience of love that we will have in heaven when the time comes. Shakespeare has a term that I love, hoops of steel. Those friends thou hast, and their adoption tried, gather them to thy soul with hoops of steel. So this for me is a good description of friendship in the Spirit and the binding power of God's love and our love for each other, how it holds us together and leads us into the procession or the parade where we can send up a delightful fragrance. Fear of heights. You remember when Moses said to the Lord, "Please, Lord, send someone else." That's an experience we sometimes have in our prayer, when we feel that more is being asked of us by God than we can possibly do. And that tension that we experience is also an aspect of our life of prayer. And then most of all, and most descriptive and most overarching, or at least I hope it to be, is the word clinging, by which I really mean a kind of hugging, a mutual embrace in which the Lord wants to hold us very close, and we learn gradually to respond to that great love. And that becomes a sure part of our connectedness with God when we are praying people and when we continually renew our understanding of the life of prayer. I would mention 3 scriptures that have been useful to me in understanding how expanded our vision and our context becomes when we have entered into this wonderful life of grace. Romans 14, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. That kind of understanding of the continuity of our life here and now and our life to come is an understanding that can be enlarged by our experience of prayer. Philippians 4, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. There is a strengthening as we become more deeply people of prayer. And Galatians 2:20, differently translated in many places. True, I am living here and now, this mortal life, but my real life is the faith I have in the Son of God. All that is descriptive of the life of prayer. Not every time of prayer is full of consolation. I think yearning is a constant of our prayer lives. And yet we begin to taste the love that we will live in the resurrection, when our knowing will be like that of the angels, and our friendships will be simple and free. For the more God's love flows into me, the more that love overflows from me into you and into the next person until we are held together in a current of joy. And the reaching and the asking is a token of the destination. There is always a deep longing within us that cuts like a knife, a yearning that stirs even when the air is flooded with sunshine and when we are dazzled with light. But in the middle of our gratitude for the beauty of things, we know there is something yet to be given. There's an emptiness that is a mark and a reminder of God, a place that he will come fully to live in us. And the days flow and the seasons turn and we hold on, and for dear life we cling. Time slips through our fingers and we surrender and we are reconciled and we accept more and more what is. And we are held tighter and tighter in the knowledge that we are loved forever and a day, held close and cherished, rescued, forgiven and redeemed. And in our prayer we are Jacob, for the angels are climbing up to God and down to us. We are climbing Jacob's ladder, and the energy is both ascending and descending, striking life into our hearts and killing us with the promise of bliss. And this I wish for each of you. Amen.
Now stay up here. We're going to get some chairs. Is DW here? Dallas? He may be praying. I don't know. Oh, thank you. Come.
Howdy.
Can you use this?
Yeah.
Sit in this middle here.
Hello,
You
Dallas.
are an absolute treasure.
So are you.
You're
Isn't
wonderful.
that lovely?
God bless you, dear.
Now, there's so much we can talk about, isn't there?
Friendship. Let's talk about friendship.
Oh, that makes me think. I'm going to take a gamble because I'm not certain I know what I'm talking about. But I wonder.
This is a new thing.
You notice that had an exclamation or a question mark exclamation there? I just want to hear the two of you talk for a minute. I know we're moving to prayer, but Simone Weil.
Yes.
And am I right that she was a leading figure in phenomenology? Is that right, Dallas?
No, that's Edith Stein.
Oh, Edith Stein, I'm sorry. Well, let me hear you two talk about Simone.
Edith Stein.
Edith Stein was in phenomenology, but what isn't known widely about Simone Weil was that she was a classmate of Jean-Paul Sartre, and he flunked his qualifying exams. And she was so smart. And Simone de Beauvoir, was same class.
Yeah, but she was not a believer.
No, she was not a believer.
Yeah.
But Simone Weil just made them all look sick. I mean, think of praying the Lord's Prayer in Greek in the grape patch. I mean, that's her.
Well,
Tell me about your interest in Simone.
Oh, I don't know. I think, what happens, as I'm sure, well, you are living proof of it, is you get lighted up on this subject, and then you want to find everything in the world that you can read and every possible writer. And I think, in the 60s or the 70s or something, Simone Weil's work came into print,
Yes.
and we all read it. And she was a wonderful person of prayer, and she had a deep relationship with Jesus Christ. And because of the persecutions against Judaism in her lifetime, she did not accept formal baptism.
Right.
But since many of us believe in a baptism of desire, you see, that's her heart was there. And she's a wonderful, wonderful, inspiring person, I think.
Yes, and she was so incredibly deep in her understanding of human life. The book I think that was first was The Need for Roots. Mm-hmm. And it was just talking about the uprooted condition of human beings, which is a beautiful description of the lost and fallen condition of humanity. Mm. She really knew that. And she was a brilliant person, but a person who never, well, in a good sense, which in the best of French tradition you understand well, she did not think abstractly. She had great power of abstraction, but she didn't think abstractly. She thought concretely. And everything she saw in the light of concrete human existence.
Wow. That's wonderful.
I don't know, you probably have a lot of questions in your pocket, but I just wanted to say that one of the great breakthroughs for me in reading the chapter on prayer and the divine conspiracy was this statement that prayer is request. And that all of the prayer is built on and flows out of request. And then there's another statement in there that I just adore. Personal negotiation. Prayer is personal negotiation. It's an encounter with God. And I thought immediately of Abraham praying for the city.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Well, would you save the city
Yes.
if there were this many people, and the interaction there.
Yes.
So I really appreciate just those two particular phrases just knocked me flat.
Dallas,
Wonderful.
could you...
And Abraham quit before God did. He quit before God. I don't know why Abraham, I guess he thought, well, I better stop.
But it's really fun to talk to you, Dallas.
Speak a little about, you have that section, the power of the request, and in a community of love. Now, help us just contextually. I know we're moving quickly through, and you speak of the whole progression, and that is the contrast between the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees and righteousness of the kingdom, that is the dikaiosune of the kingdom, and that we don't go through life by demands, we don't go through life by manipulation and so forth, but then how do we begin to move in, and that's what I want you to...
By standing before others openly. Illustration. If you have a retreat, a silent retreat, where people are together but not talking, one of the most wonderful things to see is how a request gets made. And it gets made because there is a person there to whom others are attentive in order to know what they need. And the request is the mere presence. It's the mere presence. And that is the expression of the deepest law of the universe, which is not, gravity, electromagnetism, strong force, weak force. It's love. It's love. It's love. And that's the way love works. Love wants to be asked. Love wants to ask. Love wants to give. And that's the deepest law of the universe, the most powerful thing in human relationships, which is manifested by the fact of how we will want to avoid requests sometimes, just to avoid the pull of the request. We all know about the dog watching you eat a sandwich and that sort of thing. See, that is deep. That's deep. That's request.
Yeah. Right.
That's why Jesus said, ask.
Well, and when on the personal negotiation, then you went, I think, immediately to the woman and the judge,
Yes. Absolutely.
wearing out the judge.
Right.
and his concrete way of teaching us about prayer is so practical, and of course we want to get very elevated all the time.
Yes, and that's so good because that teaches how the request stands there. The request stands there. It isn't like dive bombing, putting money in a Coke machine. It stands there. It just stands there, and that's it. And it waits. And that's a part of the personal negotiation. That gives time for things to go back and forth, changes that are needed to be made. The request just stands there and waits. And the power of that is so great. Frank Laubach's book, Prayer, the Mightiest Force on Earth. That's exactly right. The mightiest force on earth. It moves things in the area that is more fundamental. And again, that is why in nearly all of the prayer sections in the Bible, you will see first Creator mentioned, and then prayer.
Say that again.
The first it'll mention the Creator.
Okay.
Like even in the great prayer in Acts where the room was shaken. First they start out with, God, you made everything, right?
Okay.
So they're addressing the most fundamental part. That's not just to butter him up. It's to help us address rightly.
Oh, okay. Emilie, could you share a little bit? You made just a tiniest reference to Hannah.
Yes.
And that experience that you write about in Wilderness Time, which, by the way, is a wonderful book on retreat. Wilderness Time. You go rush and get it. But could you share a little of that, how in the light of request and negotiation?
Well, I just actually, I don't know anything about what it means, but I did have a wonderful experience with Hannah and Samuel. When I was first getting excited about the life of prayer, I was working in a busy office and highly stressed environment. I had 3 personal days a year. And I took one of my personal days, and instead of going shopping, I made a retreat. And I made a retreat in which I had very little structure to the day. And in the morning at church, the reading was about Hannah, and I started.
What church was this?
It was the church in New York.
Yeah.
Our Lady Queen of Martyrs
Okay.
Church. Yeah. And that morning's reading, I just simply took that, and then I went with that reading all day. And where it led me was to read the entire chapter with Hannah, and then to go on into Samuel's story of being called and, not Eli and not knowing the voice and all of that. Now, this story of Samuel was my favorite childhood story in the Bible. And I didn't know that's where I was going, but I entered into the story becoming first Hannah praying in the temple. And then staying with Hannah as long as I could, and praying the canticle of Hannah, which follows, praying that, and then moving on into being Samuel, entering into his story, and being Samuel then, and discovering this wonderful improvisational way of praying and experiencing God's love in that. And then I went home to my house in Kew Gardens, Queens at the end of the day. And I had, as some people have heard me say, a number of devout Jewish neighbors. And they found out about my interest in Hannah, and one of them said, "Emilie, did you know that Hannah invented prayer?" And I said, surely not. I mean, there must have been prayer, but there was a temple already. What they were trying to tell me was that for them, she is seen as the originator of contemplative prayer.
Right.
Remember, she's praying without words and silently in the temple and waiting for the Lord.
And of course, Hannah asked. And then as you move into the Samuel story, you see that negotiation, that time, learning the voice of God, learning to distinguish it. And Dallas, you have in Search of Guidance, I feel some of the most helpful instruction on hearing the voice of God. Do you remember some of that? Do you want me to quote it for you?
Yeah, the first sentence on page 50 is. I'm not sure I can.
I am actually
hit
thinking
the part
of
you're thinking
the way
about.
of distinguishing the voice of God, much the same way we distinguish human voices.
Yes, that's one of the dimensions of living in this negotiating relationship. Is you learn to recognize the voice. You recognize there's a quality to it. There's a kind of weight to it.
Weight.
A tone. It never gets screechy and angry and.
Excellent.
It's very
you hear
heavy.
This now?
It's peaceful.
Quality, tone,
and content.
Weight, and then content. Now explain that.
Well, content, of course, has to do with the kinds of things that would be said. I know Richard so well that if there were certain things said, I would know it was Richard. And he's the same with me. And you know others the same way. That's content. But then there is tone, and there is weight, and there's quality to it. And we pick up on all of those things through this process.
Right.
And so the definition of prayer is talking to God about what we're doing together.
Right.
And I think in that we learn to recognize. It's very safe then. It's very safe. We don't become infallible or anything like that. It's very safe.
Just on that tone, can I just give you a little, this is just something to unpack that a little. God draws and encourages. Satan pushes and condemns. You know the difference? See? It's that kind of thing that he's talking about. And as we walk through Scripture, we begin to catch a sense of the tone of God. Remember, it was said of Messiah that he would not break a bruised reed, nor quench a smoldering wick. See, Jesus would never snuff out the smallest hope, never crush the needy. And if we can understand that great doctrine of the New Testament, the Christ likeness of God. God is like Jesus. And if you get that, that will help a great deal in your understanding of prayer and of how God works with you.
That's right.
Yeah.
You know, I forgot to say something, though. You know, it occurred to me when we were talking about Hannah. There's a miracle in the story that Samuel is born.
Yes,
you know?
right.
And that's the other thing, is just accepting that power is very important, and we forget to do that.
Yeah, yes, indeed.
And we give time to it, you know. Let it stay with it. And so important.
Yeah. Let's take a question, perhaps. Here's one that I felt is very helpful. Can a person love God and doubt God's existence at the same time? Now, this has a lot to do with prayer, doesn't it? And let's just work with that a little bit. This person says, I do that. I love God and doubt God. Maybe we could just talk a little bit.
Well, aren't the Psalms sort of like that sometimes? I mean, I think that's one of the things that I think is such a gift in the Psalms, is that there are low points. Out of the depths I cry to you. And although it's not expressed specifically as doubt, certainly as discouragement. It's being at a really low point. And Jesus used this psalm. And we know that there are heights and depths in our relationship to God. And I think that, you know, that doesn't mean we wouldn't want to work through those.
Yeah.
But I think to feel that you're always on this cheerful, high, totally confident, relaxed level, that's not the human condition.
Today, there's this quest for the holy grin all of the time. I just have to say, that's just holy baloney. And because Emilie spoke about the dark night of the soul and darkness as a definite aspect of prayer. And we don't try to rescue people when they're in that.
A good companion question is, can you pray to God and doubt that he exists?
Yeah.
The answer is obviously yes. It may be better if you don't doubt, but the multitudes of people actually have been saved by the prayer that we call the atheist prayer. Oh my God, if there is a God, save my soul if I have a soul. Now, I'm telling you, many people have been saved by that prayer. And the reason why is because it is prayed out of the depths.
Deep calls to deep.
The deep calls to deep, and God answers. And I often tell people, I can give you God's address. It's the end of your rope. You see, that prayer is prayed at the end of your rope.
That's good.
And we can love God and doubt his existence. Mm-hmm. That love will be a kind of wistful love. Mm-hmm. But we can. And, when we have faith and we don't have faith or whatever, we're not proving anything to God. We don't have to prove anything.
At that address, could I give you a prayer? It might help you. I mean, some really struggle with, how do you pray, compose a prayer? How do the words work? And I want to give you a prayer at the end of the rope. It's a very liturgical prayer, so you may want to write it down. It goes this way. Oh God, help!
That's it. And that goes with Paul's, whosoever calleth on the name of the Lord shall be saved. You do it like that.
Now here's a question that I think is helpful. When we spoke, Dallas, and you said, we seek God long enough so that when we find him, we will be able to stand it.
Yes.
And he asks the question, are we there, or at what point? But unpack that a little in terms of, why the necessity of being able, the process and how we are at that.
When we first start thinking of God, we're basically in the position of the idolater. We think of God who might be helpful in our projects. A little thing for God to do. So we get the image of God as the cosmic butler, the great aspirin in the sky, that sort of thing. So it's all in terms of us. I mean, think of James and John sending mommy, to Jesus and saying, now, my boy's one on the front row. And they came and said, well, we'd like this, that, and the other. And Jesus said, can you drink the cup that I drink and be baptized with the baptism? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, actually, in time they did, But it's a matter of pulling the things in a straight for God. We're all wired up wrongly by our experience in the world and perhaps deeper stuff that we don't even know about that's working in a fallen world. And so we come to God with all of our prayers and all of our needs and all that sort of thing. But God is faithful to us. And as we stay in that posture, we change. And that temporal elongation of prayer. And that's why Jesus teaches perseverance in prayer.
Stay with it.
Yeah. Stay with it.
Don't you think Peter's just the most wonderful example
Yes.
of a man who changed so much over, and a doubter,
Absolutely.
and rebellious along the way, and that you see it, and you see it in other people. You can't see the change in yourself.
Right, and I think it would be best for me to kind of fill in for the Are You Are There. I've known Dallas for 29 years, and I just want to say, in terms of somebody whose soul is prepared to contain the power of God and the knowledge of God, I've not seen a soul greater who's able. Now, he is embarrassed to hear me say that. I've known Emilie about 12, 13 years, so a little less perhaps, and yet here is someone who has grown into a life of prayer from the world of business. Her description of coming up with the advertising campaign for Alcoa aluminum, qualities of aluminum, and how that is a spiritual experience to make those commercials and work with that. And then the stepping in that she went through with her mother's death. And she wrote a book out of that, Homeward Voyage. Is that right? Homeward Voyage. And watching that and listening, I can tell you that their souls have grown. And you know, that's a great project, isn't it?
And we're not really in charge of it, you know.
Yeah.
And that's why I think for each of us, it's just a matter of staying there, hanging in. We don't know where we're going.
Yeah.
Our growth is not something under our management, you know, but we know where to stay, and we stay there, and then God knows when we're ready. And that will go on for eternity. You've been faithful over a few things.
Childhood is a wonderful way of looking at this. You know, when we're growing, when we're children, and the adults come and say how you've grown, and we have no idea how that went.
That's it.
And
It's true.
you know, we have to listen to them say it, you know, but we don't get it. And I think there's so many experiences in childhood that are analogs for what the spiritual life is like. Don't you think?
I do. And by the way, I want to read this translation that Dallas has given us of the Lord's Prayer in just a moment. But first, you all don't know. How'd I do? You all don't know this, but Emilie is something of certainly a deep student of, if not a scholar of, John Milton. So can you give us a Milton quote? I didn't prepare her for this. A Milton quote that might step into some of what we have been working on.
Thousands at his bidding speed.
Thousands at his bidding speed.
And post or land.
You see,
They also serve who only stand and wait.
isn't it wonderful?
Well, you can say something like, better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven, right?
How about this? I get my turn. I love it. Do you recall that it's Satan who says the mind is its own place and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven? For Milton, the mind was the great source of joy and wonder, but also a great source of entrapment. And I think that, you know, that line has stayed with me always. And then, so when we join to that putting on the mind of Christ, that's when we really come home. You know.
Lovely. Yeah. Listen to the way the Lord's Prayer now has been given. And you want to turn and set down things and be in an attitude, a mode, a posture of prayer. Let us pray. Dear Father, always near us, may your name be treasured and loved. May your rule be completed in us. May your will be done here on earth in just the way it is done in heaven. Give us today the things we need today, and forgive us our sins and impositions on you as we are forgiving all who in any way offend us. Please don't put us through trials, but deliver us from everything bad, because you are the one in charge, and you have all the power, and the glory too is all yours forever, which is just the way we want it. Amen.